the famed Camelot, his magical sword Excalibur, the romance between Sir Lancelot and Guinevere, Merlin, the Knights of the Round Table, and the Isle of Avalon are just a few enchanting themes in this ancient saga that historians have long considered to be pure fantasy. Today, Graham Phillips will present compelling evidence that such legends are actually based on real people and real events. Hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and you're listening to Just Energy. Today's author, Graham Phillips, has been described as a historical detective, a modern-day adventurer, and a real-life Indiana Jones. As a former radio journalist and BBC broadcaster, Phillips is a historical investigator and author of 13 books, including The Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, Merlin and the Discovery of Avalon in the New World, and The Chalice of Magdalene and the End of Eden. So please welcome Graham Phillips. Hey, Graham, and welcome to Just Energy. How are you doing today?
Very much. Thank you for having me on this program.
Well, I think it's pretty cool. One of my favorite books of all time was Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, which talks about the Arthurian legend, obviously from a different perspective, which we'll talk about. But I think it's really cool that you're investigating this whole line of research, because there aren't very many people these days that are looking into these myths that have been so enduring.
Well, there aren't. I mean, I think the main reason is that people either tend to go onto the romance side of the story. In other words, in the Middle Ages, there was lots of stories written about King Arthur fighting dragons, rescuing damsels in distress, and all that sort of thing. And that was the romantic Arthur of the Middle Ages. And people who are interested in that tend to be making movies about Arthur. They tend to be making TV shows about the Arthurian court, Merlin or whatever, and writing fictional accounts, novels, all set in the Arthurian court. And then on the other hand, you've got the King Arthur that some historians believe may have been an historical figure, but because he's so tied up with myth and fantasy, many archaeologists and historians tend to steer well clear of that and say, well, no, I'm not going to get involved in looking into an historical King Arthur because he's associated with, New Age sort of things. And it was that I dared to do, look into the historical side of King Arthur, despite the fact I might be ridiculed. So I was probably one of the only people doing it.
Uh-huh. Well, what got you started investigating ancient mysteries in the first place? Because this is obviously not your first book talking about, ancient stories that have come into the present.
Well, I've written a number of books about historical mysteries over the years, about 15, I think, but it started about 30 years ago. I used to edit a magazine called Strange Phenomena, all about the paranormal, and the magazine looked into cases where people had seen everything from UFOs to ghosts and, you name it. And when that magazine eventually, I left there, I found that some of the mysteries that I was most interested in were to do with historical conundrums and enigmas. Like, was it a real Robin Hood, for example? Mm-hmm. Where was Alexander the Great buried? And Arthur came about. Every time I was investigating something, Arthur would tend to come into it. And so I'd investigate a bit and then stop and then take it up again between books. And so really the research that I've done that's now put into this book about King Arthur is the kind of culmination of 25 years of research, but it's not all the time.
Uh-huh. Well, and in your new book, wait, let me hold it up, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, why do you think this legend, why do you think the story of Arthur has endured into the present time?
It's an interesting one. There are a number of reasons. Firstly, in the Middle Ages in Britain, where the whole of the story is set, the people who ruled the country were French. They invaded the country in 1066, the Normans from northern France. And the English people before that were Anglo-Saxons. And so the Anglo-Saxons were the ordinary people, and the rulers, the aristocrats, were the French. In fact, they spoke two different languages. English, as we now know it, or Old English, was spoken by the Anglo-Saxons, and French was spoken by the aristocrats. And modern English has become a combination of the two. Now, both of these people developed their heroic figures that became the subject of romantic fiction during the Middle Ages. The ordinary people, who tended not to be able to read or write, their hero became the mythical Robin Hood, the man who robbed from the rich to give to the poor, who fought against the evil sheriff and the bad King John and so forth. And because people couldn't read the tales of Robin Hood, they tended to be transmitted in the form of ballads and songs and plays that performed around the country. To counteract this, the stories of King Arthur, which had been kicking around for a number of years, like many other historical figures, had various legends and myths attached to them, became very popular in the Middle Ages, but in the form of written works that could be understood by the upper classes, the French. And these stories were kind of developed, in a sense, to counteract the legend of Robin Hood, which had been taken to heart by the oppressed ordinary people of England. And you will in fact find that if you read the stories of Robin Hood and you read the stories of King Arthur, there are great overlaps. For example, King Arthur is known for his sword Excalibur. He is the greatest swordsman in the land, or if he has a sword that does all these magical things. Robin Hood is the greatest bowman in the land. He's the greatest archer. And in the very first story, he gains this power when he wins this golden arrow, when he has this, becomes even greater than he was before, when he wins a golden arrow in an archery contest at Sherwood. Now, the ordinary person in an army in Britain, in England at the time, would have had a job as a longbowman. That was the weapon of the peasant people. Only aristocrats could carry swords. And so you've got Robin and his bow, Arthur and his sword. Let's take this, for example. When King Arthur first meets his right-hand man, who is Sir Lancelot, Lancelot is guarding a bridge, and he says, no one can cross this unless they can defeat me. And Arthur eventually does in a duel, not to the death, but he defeats Lancelot. Fighting, he brings Excalibur into it, which is has the power to defeat anybody, so he cheats and wins. When Robin first meets his lieutenant, if you like, his right-hand man, Little John is guarding a log over a river with a quarterstaff, and he says, no one can pass unless they defeat me, and Robin beats him by cheating. You look through the stories, there are many, many similarities between the Robin Hood story and the King Arthur story, and these developed during the Middle Ages. So what I'm saying is that although there might have been earlier stories of King Arthur, in fact there were, the King Arthur that became so popular during the Middle Ages, so it then became one of the first books in print in English, even before the Bible, when they developed printing press in the 1400s. The reason it's so popular is because it was a kind of, Arthur was used as a crucial figure in a medieval propaganda exercise to counteract the propaganda of the mythical Robin Hood.
That is so interesting. You know, and unless you go and investigate, try to look behind the narratives or what's going on in a culture or society, no one would ever know that piece of information, that there were basically classes of story narratives that were designed more for one group versus the other group.
Absolutely. And if you don't look into the background, a lot of it doesn't make sense.
True. So let's move on. We're talking a little bit about King Arthur. What's his history? Can you just tell a little bit about who he is and who he was?
Yes, in these stories written about King Arthur start in the Middle Ages, in the 1100s, in the mid 1100s, And then Arthur is said to have been, it's said that he lived around 500 AD, and it's said that he was one of the last British kings to be fighting. Remember I said the Anglo-Saxons were invaded by the French?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Anglo-Saxons were in turn earlier invaders themselves. The people of Britain, the native people of Britain in 500 AD were known as the Britons. They were Celts, the same people as you get in Ireland and northern France. They were Celtic people who had been under Roman rule. And when the Romans left Britain in the 400s, Britain was left, it's almost, imagine the whole police force and the army disappeared from any modern society today. It wouldn't be long before it fell into a state of anarchy, and that's what happened in Britain. And into this kind of anarchistic country, which had divided into separate feuding kingdoms, the Anglo-Saxons came from their homeland in northern Germany to invade what's now England. And Arthur is portrayed as being one of the last British kings, native Celtic kings, to make a successful stand against the Anglo-Saxons before they came in and took over all of what's now England. So that's who he actually is supposed to have been.
And I think that's interesting because I had always been led to believe that he was the last pagan king with the advent of Christianity being to the British Islands. Were those parallel?
Yes and no. He's probably more likely to have been. The advent of Christianity in Britain is a quite rather strange thing. It's not pure and simple and straightforward. The Romans that were here for a few hundred years until 410 AD when they left, in the last 100 years of the Roman Empire was a Christian empire. The emperors had become Christians. So churches were being built in England and Britain at the end of the Roman period. When the Romans left, some people were Christians, some people were pagans. So when Arthur is here around 500 AD, the country, there are Christians and there are pagans too, but they are early Christians who still a kind of a hybrid religion between Christianity and paganism called Celtic Christianity. So Arthur may have been a Christian, he may have been a pagan, but he wouldn't be much of a Christian as we'd understand it today. He wouldn't have been a typical Roman Catholic, shall we say. Mm-hmm. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were purely pagan at this point. They had gods such as Woden, who's their version of the Viking Odin, and so forth. They had their own gods, and they didn't know anything about or had no interest in Christianity. They invaded Britain, and so if anyone was the pagans, they were. And Arthur's side were possibly Christians, and they were kind of hybrid Christian pagans. So it's kind of the opposite way to how it's often portrayed.
That's really interesting. I mean, because I thought that was, the main underlying kind of piece of story that went through the Arthur narrative was the abolition of paganism, and getting rid of all of the wizards and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, this is how it's told in later times. The people who wrote about the stories of Arthur in the Middle Ages, they weren't historians. They had no archaeology. They didn't know what had been going on 700 years earlier. I mean, 600 or 700 years earlier had been the time Arthur really lived. It's like going back to before Shakespeare's time. I mean, it's like going back to the time of Richard III. I mean, what do we know about it? If we didn't have history books or archaeologists, how did he live? Well, I don't know. He might have lived like we do now. And in fact, this is why the King Arthur of the Middle Ages in the romantic stories is depicted as a knight in shining armor, broadsword, and a lion living in a huge Gothic castle, because that's the kind of places they had and the kind of way they fought and dressed in the Middle Ages. But going back 500, 600, 700 years earlier, the period Arthur really did live, people still dressed like Romans. Arthur would have fought in Roman-style armor and had Roman-style weapons, and the kind of buildings that they've had of fortifications would have been wooden stockades with watchtowers, not the great Gothic castles of hundreds of years later. And the reason why all this gets confused is that there were no such things as proper historians really in the Middle Ages. It wasn't until people started collecting historical manuscripts and putting together in the discipline of history, which comes many years later, and archaeology begins, that we actually knew what these people looked like, how they lived, and what their lifestyle was. And in fact, this was normal for any old ancient stories, such as the legends of Greece and Rome. They were often set in a medieval context. In fact, if you see biblical stories being painted by medieval artists, you will see all the characters standing around the crucifixion, for example. They're not dressed as Roman soldiers, they're dressed as evil knights, because they had no idea what people would have looked like in biblical times. And this is why Arthur is depicted so differently in the myths and legends as to the person that he would really have been had he existed around 500 AD.
Well, and if he was using like Roman weaponry, he would be carrying a relatively short sword, not a long broadsword, because the Romans, their swords were kind of small.
They had two types of sword: the short stabbing weapon known as a gladius by the infantry, foot soldiers, to stab people as they went forward. And the cavalry used a sword about 2 or 3 feet long, known as a sparta, which was so you'd lop people's heads off as you went past. The big broadsword had in the Middle Ages were to knock knights in shining armor off horses. They were meant for a totally different purpose. They were developed as a kind of as a countermeasure to plate armor. The kind of armor that the Romans would have had would be small bits of armor on the shoulder, mainly chainmail. And so to carry around a huge, great broadsword just to knock somebody out, there's no point. You might as well just throw a spear at them.
I don't even know how the knights walked around with that armor on in the first place. It just looks way too heavy to me.
But its heaviness was the biggest problem, especially if they were fighting in the Crusades in the Middle East. Imagine the heat. Imagine being in 100 degrees in a desert.
In a tin can.
Yeah. That's how I don't understand. But most, during the Crusades in the Middle Ages, when these knights in armour were fighting in places like what's now Israel, the biggest amount of deaths were caused through not injuries in battle, but heat exhaustion. And also from disease. Imagine the diseases you're going to catch stuck inside a tin can in a desert. Well, you know, that's that. But that form of fight developed in the Middle Ages when they learned how to make plate armor, and they didn't have these kind of knights. The real King Arthur would have lived in a wooden stockade. The real King Arthur would have lived like a Roman, and he'd have fought with a shorter sword. He wouldn't have been, unfortunately, like the kind of character we imagine him to be today.
Then I would guess that perhaps the story of the sword and the stone is not how it appears to have come down to us today.
Well, there are certain aspects. I mean, I wanted to try and find out how many of these stories that are written about Arthur are likely to have based on some kind of historical fact, even though they've been medievalized later on. And one of the ones I thought most unlikely was the theme of Excalibur, Arthur's sword, and being thrown, for example, to the Lady of the Lake. And in the famous medieval story that most school kids today know, Arthur, as he's lying dying on the field of battle, asks his knight, one of his trusted knights, if he can take Excalibur to a nearby lake and throw it in. And when the knight eventually does so, the arm of a mysterious nymph-like creature called the Lady of the Lake, a kind of lake-dwelling mermaid with legs, her arm comes from the water, grabs the weapon by the hilt, and takes it down into the crystal depths. That's the story of the Lady of the Lake. The knight then returns to find Arthur has been taken away by 3 mysterious maidens, taken across the lake to a magical isle of Avalon, where he either is buried or he sleeps, awaiting to awaken in sometime in the future. Now, that story just sounds like a really made-up part of it. But around 500 AD, from the writings that do survive of that period, we know there was a tradition about British warriors that during their funeral, their swords would be thrown into a lake or a sacred lake or pool, as an offering to a water goddess. Now, this is the pagan side of things. But the early Christians carried on with this tradition, but believed they were throwing an offering to a saint. So a water goddess would become a saint. Now, the name of the Lady of the Lake in the Arthurian story is called Vivian. And there's an early Celtic water goddess called Viviana. Vivian. In other words, the story of the Arthur saw being thrown to the Lady of the Lake could have originated because of a real funerary practice. When Arthur's dying, his sword is thrown as an offering to a sacred lake, to a goddess, or perhaps an early saint called Viviana, which became the Lady of the Lake Vivian. So even stories like King Arthur's sword, even though they've become magical in later years, may have started off being real historical events.
And I've heard that before, where in a lot of the ancient narratives, ones like King Arthur or Robin Hood, that they take different stories from different places and kind of amalgamate them into and around one individual. Kind of even like they talk about Jesus, that, you know, there's Jesus, the character, and there's the narratives and different. We hear that, I can't think of the word, but
well, they've
are
been
more
sort of
traditional.
into the same story.
Right.
They've been adopted into that story by the people of the time, because the people who are hearing those stories have already got their own existing narratives that they want to join onto it. And this definitely, absolutely happened in Arthur's case. But the Lady of the Lake, an early goddess, finds herself into the Arthur story. But she's not the only one. There's an early Celtic goddess called Guinevere, which means white lady or white spirit. Well, she could have become the Guinevere that then is Arthur's wife or queen, according to the story. The real historical Arthur, should he have really existed, may never have had a wife called Guinevere. She may have been called Rita, for all I know. But somebody later says, well, we've got this mythical goddess who's the queen of the underworld in our legends and mythology, which she needs to be dragged in somewhere along the line. And this is probably how it went.
But that makes sense with a lot. It makes sense because you find elements like you were discussing earlier in the Robin Hood story and the King Arthur story that are parallel. It's because they're pulling from basically the same pool and base of information.
Well, yeah, and some of these stories were completely, I mean, like one of the characters, for example, that is really added onto the story later on in the medieval period is the figure of Lancelot. Now, it seems that Lancelot was already a character that existed in medieval stories, but has got no connection with Arthur. But because he was so popular, he starts being added into the Arthurian story, which actually leads on to another invention of the Middle Ages, and that is the name Camelot. Arthur is said to have ruled from the most magnificent city in the country, and it's called Camelot. Now, you'd think, well, if we're actually looking for historical Arthur, man behind the legend, to see if he existed, well, can't we go to a place called Camelot and see if he ever ruled from there? Problem is, there's nowhere in Britain called Camelot now, or there's no evidence there ever was. Well, the reason for this is that a French writer, British French, he came from France, but he was writing about Britain because they were the ruling class in Britain. A French writer called Chrétien de Troyes in the 1190s wrote a story about King Arthur and Lancelot, and he needed a word to rhyme with Lancelot, which is where Camelot comes from. So it's completely made up. Or there are earlier stories of King Arthur, and they do refer to him ruling from Buffalo and magnificent city, but it's not given a name. We're not told what his capital is called. It seems that by the Middle Ages, if Arthur lived and he had a capital, people have forgotten where and what it was called. And in fact, that was one of the first things I decided to do from an historical point of view, is to try and trace around 500 AD, when Arthur lived, what was historically the most powerful city.
And did you find it?
Well, okay, you need to know a little bit of history of this time. I'll make it very short and sweet. 500 AD, the Anglo-Saxons are invading Britain from northern Germany. The four most important cities in the country are all old Roman cities. One of them, the three largest, London, Lincoln and York, are all in the east of England. They're invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, which left the fourth largest, which is a city called Viraconium, which is right in the centre of England, as the effective capital of Britain around 500 AD. So if Arthur did exist, that is the most likely historical place for him to have come from. So let us examine that firstly. Now, unlike London, Lincoln and York, where the old Roman and Dark Age cities are now buried beneath the streets of the modern towns, you'd have, in other words, to excavate the old cities of those places, you'd have to dig up office blocks and houses and everything else, theatres, you name it. The difference between Viraconium in the centre of England and these other cities is that it never, once it was eventually abandoned, a new city wasn't built over it. So there's nothing there now. Its ruins lie in the middle of farmland in the countryside in the centre of England. And its ruins can still be seen. Parts of its walls can still be seen there, dating from Roman times. And because it lies in open countryside, it's meant that archaeology can go on there. So we know a lot about what was happening there around 500 AD, which we don't necessarily know the same about, for example, in London. And it has been shown that around that time, the city was still being occupied at a time when many of the earlier Roman-type cities were being abandoned for more easily defendable hilltops. And that it was completely refortified, rebuilt. It was still a surviving Roman-style town when everywhere else was a complete anarchy, Dark Age mess, pretty much. But what's so amazing is that right in the centre of this town, around 500 AD, there was a massive new building constructed, which seems to have been the palace of an extremely important Dark Age warlord. And archaeologists say this may have been the man who ruled Britain around 500 AD. So in other words, Arthur is said to have ruled Britain from the most magnificent city in the country around 500 AD, the most significant city in the country in 500 AD was this place Viraconium. So if you're looking for an historical Camelot, that's where you should go.
If you're enjoying today's programming, please click on the button below and subscribe to our channel. If you want to hear the complete interview with Graham Phillips, become a Just Energy Radio Insider and access full shows commercial-free. And don't forget to share this interview with your friends on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Until next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and remember, it's all just energy.